Okay, we ready? Okay, well, welcome. Thanks for coming. I'm going to stick close to the mic because I'm like Alex. I'm going to read my talk today. I'm calling it a lecture. It's a talk. So to make it testing? No? Testing? Okay, there. All right. So I'm going to read my talk, but before I start, I want to say something about how I got started on this journey. I moved to Cincinnati in 1977 to live with my brother and his family in Paddock Hills, which is a little neighborhood a couple of miles north of here. And I was struck by the fact that it was racially integrated and stable, and I was really curious about that. A few months later, I moved to a communal household on the border between North Avondale and Avondale on what was then South Crescent Avenue. And I lived with a bunch of other people, 7 or 8 other people in this big old Victorian mansion. And all of our neighbors, almost all of our neighbors, were working class or middle class African Americans. And many of the houses on the street were also mansions, and it seemed to me that something had probably changed. So I asked longtime friends of mine who were longtime Cincinnatians about what had happened, and they said, well, urban renewal. Then I went to graduate school, started graduate school, and was fortunate enough to be in a graduate urban history class that required graduate students to do original research. So I started tinkering with what I could find out about what had happened on South Crescent and when change had happened. And the rest, as they say, is history. Eventually wrote a doctoral dissertation with Avondale at its core. So, what I'm going to do today is explore very briefly Avondale's early history, but I'm going to spend most of my attention looking at racial change in Avondale, why Avondale's changed from a majority white neighborhood to a majority black one between about 1940 and 1970. I'll also briefly touch on changes in the neighborhood since that period. If I tried to get all of this in, you'd be here all afternoon, and I'd be tired, you'd be tired, and probably taking your naps. So here's a map from 1869 of the village of Avondale. Until about 1840, Avondale included only a few farms, country estates, and other residences. Population began to increase in the 1840s, and in 1864, Avondale's residents voted to incorporate as a village. Many of the village's residents were families of wealthy white businessmen, numbers of whom commuted to Cincinnati by carriage or train. By 1878, there were 2,455 individuals living in Avondale. 241 of them were African American, so about 10% of the population was African American. Many of these black residents worked as servants in the homes of their white neighbors or as laborers. In addition to employment opportunities in the village, a series of anti-black riots in Cincinnati that occurred repeatedly from the late 1820s through the Civil War likely led some African Americans to seek the relative safety afforded by the village. Blacks were repeatedly brutally attacked in what we think of as downtown Cincinnati now, but which was the city back then. Avondale, in this period, became home to two of the Cincinnati area's most important African American institutions. By 1880, the Colored American Cemetery. Oh, can we have that slide back up? Okay. So, well, I think you can see it well enough. It's the top right, somewhat north of here. And then in 1866, the Orphan Asylum for Colored Youth relocated from downtown to the southern part of the neighborhood, next to the home of Levi Coffin, a leading white participant in the Underground Railroad. We don't know for sure, but I think we speculate that Coffin, who was also a trustee of the orphan asylum, probably was instrumental in moving the asylum to Avondale. Avondale began to grow and become more connected with the city when in the late 1880s, an expanding electrified streetcar system began to make it practical for large numbers of Cincinnatians to escape the increasingly cramped and filthy basin of the city. That until then had contained much of Cincinnati's population and industry. In 1896, seeking to recapture wealth and tax revenue, Cincinnati annexed Avondale and as well as several other middle class and wealthy suburban villages. So you have to think of this area as the suburbs in the 1800s up to around the turn of the century. Although African Americans, I'm jumping ahead, sorry. So about the same time that Cincinnati annexed Avondale, a large population of German Jews began to settle in the neighborhood. By the 1920s and 1930s, numbers of synagogues, Jewish-owned businesses, and other Jewish institutions lined Reading Road and nearby streets. And if you take the tour, here's a plug for taking the digital history tour. The instructions are online, and I will remind you all of that later by an email. If you drive up and down Reading Road and look closely, you can see the remnants of Jewish symbols, Star of David, and the like on many of the African American churches that line Reading Road. Some estimates peg the Jewish population in the interwar years as 2/3 of the total of the neighborhood. So next slide. Although African Americans, especially those who were professionals and middle class, also sought to escape the basin, racial discrimination barred them from most suburban areas and concentrated them in the city's West End. The city of Cincinnati has divided the West End up into two, what they call statistical neighborhood approximations. So let me see, on your left is the outline of what's now called the West End, and on your right is the outline of what's called Queensgate. The divide is I-75. The western edge is the Mill Creek. I believe the northern edge is the Western Hills Viaduct. And then the eastern edge is I believe, Central Parkway. I think of those two as a single neighborhood. African Americans, especially those who were professional and middle class, also sought to escape the basin, but racial discrimination barred them from doing that. Concentrating them in the West End, one of the city's oldest and most deteriorated residential neighborhoods. This became Cincinnati's first racial ghetto, and urban historians talk about the first ghetto and the second ghetto. First ghetto is the concentration of blacks in restricted areas starting in the early part of the 20th century. The second ghetto develops in American cities after World War II. By 1940, the West End had become home to 64% of the city's African American population, and it was 74% black. Much of the housing available to blacks was low quality, high cost, and overcrowded. Nevertheless, several small African American enclaves did develop outside the basin. One such enclave with roots in the 19th century, we've already mentioned, included the area around the Colored Orphan Asylum in South Avondale, and lapped over into a much larger area of the adjacent Walnut Hills neighborhood. So up near the intersection of MLK and Reading Road, and east of there, down into the valley where I-71 still is, or is now, and then over into Walnut Hills, over to near the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. That neighborhood was home to a number of middle class and professional African American families. So next slide. Oh, you've got, okay. So briefly, you can see an outline of Avondale on your right and Walnut Hills on your left. So if you could smush them together, they would make one large area. And the African American neighborhood was went from about Reading Road and MLK over into Walnut Hills. By 1940, that settlement included about 8,600 African Americans who made up about 15% of the city's black population. Its Avondale section was home to about almost 1,400 African Americans who accounted for 39% of the neighborhood's black population. Two other small enclaves in Avondale contained another 40%. One of them lay just north of the Cincinnati Zoo, and the third was on Rockdale Avenue between Victory Parkway and Reading Road. That latter one was a home to more prosperous blacks, including doctors, lawyers, teachers, and Pullman car porters. Other African Americans in this period lived in the homes of wealthy whites who employed them as servants. So racial housing discrimination throughout Cincinnati was enforced by a number of means. These included legally binding restrictions in real estate deeds, like the one that's on the screen. I don't know, can you? Okay. It says in the circled part, the above described property shall not be sold, leased, rented to, or occupied by persons not of the white or Caucasian race, except that they might be occupied by the usual domestic servants of bona fide residents, even if said servants are not of the aforesaid race. That means nobody that's not white can live in that house independently. If you're non-white, you have to be a servant. Or you can't live there. This deed was for a house in Bond Hill. A student of mine, an older African-American woman, was talking about these in a class, and she said, my deed still has this. It was illegal by that time. It had been illegal since 1947. But before that, these were legally enforceable agreements. And if an African American somehow came to possess a house with one of these deeds, they could be forced out by law enforcement. Also, there was a real estate code of ethics that was subscribed to by the Cincinnati Realtors Group that barred real estate agents from helping black buyers and renters move into white areas. White homeowners associations also formed with the express intent of keeping blacks out, sometimes through violence and intimidation. In addition, white mortgage lenders almost universally refused to loan money to black home buyers. Some small black-owned savings and loans did loan to blacks, but at higher interest rates. Next. A major contribution to racial discrimination in the interwar period came from the practice of banks, mortgage companies, and the federal government rating residential areas based on whether they were believed to be good investment risks. Part of the way they determined whether they were good investment risks was they looked at who already lived there. If they were white, middle class, not too many immigrants, then they were highly rated and acceptable for acceptable mortgage risks. This one is for Covington, Kentucky. I have been looking, and other people have been looking for years for the one for Cincinnati. We're absolutely certain that it was done. We don't know where it is. It could be buried somewhere in City Hall, or it could have gone into the dumpster 20 years ago. That's the way doing history works. So areas that were marked in red, the origin of the term redlining, were African American and racially mixed areas, received the lowest ratings. These areas were ineligible for mortgage loans or home improvement loans from conventional lenders. For the areas that were deemed safe for investment, the federal government developed loan programs starting in the 1930s that subsidized mortgage interest rates and made it possible for many more middle-class families to purchase homes. This is the origin of the 30-year mortgage. Low monthly payments, same amount every month, with federally subsidized interest rates. Let's see. These programs had the greatest impact. These programs had their greatest impact in the years after World War II. The regulations, federal regulations setting up these reforms did not mention race, but they generally required lenders to award mortgages only to families buying in neighborhoods rated at low risk for real estate loans. Because developers, real estate agents, mortgage companies, and individual white property owners largely refused to sell or rent to blacks in these areas, almost all of the benefit of these federal programs went to white buyers. These policies fueled the rapid development of all white suburbs after World War II. The housing situation in Cincinnati had been made worse in during World War II, as Southerners, both black and white, streamed into the city looking for jobs in war-related industries. This was the second Great Migration. There were virtually no housing available in black areas. So families doubled or tripled up, living in attics, garages, shacks, and basements. And the situation was a little better for white migrants. My parents, who got married in 1945 in Chicago, first lived in a rented room from an older widow until my mother became visibly pregnant, and then they moved to a converted garage that they rented. Starting in the immediate post-war period, Avondale was the scene of a population shift that saw its largely middle and upper middle-class white population replaced by African Americans whose incomes ranged from struggling working class to upper middle class. So a full range. Actually, probably the first African Americans to migrate into Avondale tended to be more middle class with more income, less wealthy African Americans than followed. The population in the neighborhood grew from the black population in the neighborhood grew from 1,907, or about 8% of the population in 1940, to 20,707, or 91% of the population. And I can't remember whether this is 1960 or 1970, so I'm going to turn around and look at this. 1970. So, in a period of 30 years, the population grew, of African Americans in Avondale grew tenfold, and the percentage of African Americans within the neighborhood reached 91%. At the same time, the black population of the city more than doubled. So it had been 55,593, 12%. 12% of the total population of the city in 1940. To 125,070, or 28% of the population of the city in 1970. In 1940, 67% of Cincinnati blacks, or a little over 37,000, lived in the West End. By 1970, only 13% of the city's African American population lived in the West End, about 16,500. In 1940, the black population outside the West End was just over 18,000. So slightly less than half of the black population in 1940 lived outside the West End. By 1970, the black population outside the West End had increased to about 108,500. So we're seeing a huge black population increase between 1940 and 1970 in a severely discriminatory and restricted housing market. So intense competition for decent housing. So this population shift occurred for a number of reasons, including that an increasing number of black families had benefited from higher income during and after World War II. We'd come out of the Depression. The war machine put people to work. The economy continued to boom for a number of years after that. And to some extent, blacks were able to take advantage of that. So they were looking for better, black families in Cincinnati were looking for better housing and didn't want to be trapped in the old decaying black ghetto neighborhoods. So there was a great deal of pressure, desire of African Americans to move out of the West End. But the racial discrimination that encompassed virtually the entire Cincinnati housing market concentrated the city's rapidly increasing black population in Avondale, Walnut Hills, Evanston, and several smaller areas. Most white real estate agents continue to abide by their code of ethics that require racial discrimination in real estate sales and rentals. Redlining continued, and black real estate agents found it difficult to find properties for their clients outside existing black areas unless blacks were already moving in nearby. The Walnut Hills, South Avondale black community soon became one of the nuclei of Cincinnati's post-war African American residential areas, in part because it remained the most populous black enclave outside the West End. This community was home to a number of middle-class African American families and had a business district in Walnut Hills served by a number of black-owned businesses. In 1950, Avondale itself was home to almost 3,500 African Americans, almost all of them in South Avondale, Rockdale, the Rockdale area, and north of the zoo. By 1960, the part of Avondale south of Mitchell and Dana had become 69% black, almost 20,000 individuals, and contained 18% of the city's African American population. Most of the remaining whites lived on the periphery of the neighborhood, and at the same time, Avondale north of Mitchell and Dana remained 98% white and had increasingly come to be identified as North Avondale. North Avondale, everybody knew, was white and middle to upper middle class. By 1960, everybody knew that Avondale was black and poor. So if you were looking for a house, you had some guidance. Rapid change in the city was also driven by urban renewal and interstate highway construction that began in the late 1950s as part of the city's plan to eliminate the city's oldest neighborhoods. The West End, despite it being home to a vibrant black community and its institutions, schools, churches, funeral homes, corner stores, Masonic temples, the West End, despite all this, raised particular concern because of its jumbled and decaying mix of housing, industry, and commercial areas, and because it lay in the path of the construction of I-75. The fact that it was a majority black area no doubt added to it being identified as a problem area. To accomplish these plans, the city projected relocating thousands of African American families into public and private low-income housing developments in other neighborhoods. These plans largely failed due to political pressure from whites and because of inadequate funding. In other words, the city went ahead with its urban renewal and highway construction plans to displace thousands of black families and failed to provide decent replacement housing. This meant that any neighborhood open to blacks rapidly filled with families desperately in need of housing. Plans for a new middle-income residential area in the West End called Parktown, which is still there, largely failed to attract many white middle-class buyers, as most of the new housing in the West End was either public housing or low-income privately developed apartment complexes. Some whites resisted the movement of African Americans into their neighborhoods with violence and intimidation, but many more chose to move to new all-white locations as blacks moved in. The white exodus from Avondale included much of this Jewish population who by about 1970 had moved in large numbers to newer city neighborhoods, Bond Hill, Roselawn, Amberley, and eventually Blue Ash. For those seeking new homes, either white or black, racially explicit real estate ads in the newspapers informed readers of the race of the buyers. You probably can't read the ads, but the top one advertises a colored man's dream, and the photograph is Hamilton County Auditor's website photo of that particular house maybe 10 or 15 years ago. Others say, I think the one below that says Avondale North, unrestricted. You know what that means. And then the one below that just says Avondale North, which is a little unclear, but probably means colored people need not apply. And then the bottom one that's not outlined says Avondale colored. You can map the boundary between white Avondale and black Avondale in the real estate ads in the 1950s and watch it could slowly move north from around here to the Mitchell-Dana corridor. Okay. Federal housing policy developed in the 1930s that favored new single-family homes in white suburban neighborhoods contributed significantly to the movement of whites out of neighborhoods near existing black areas. But this was never fast enough to accommodate the surging black population of the city. This meant that there was significantly higher demand for housing among African Americans than there was supply. Basic economic law. This meant that landlords, real estate agents, and the few lenders who would serve black buyers could charge inflated prices. So years ago, I did a kind of a cursory look at interest rates and found that interest rates in black Avondale were higher than interest rates in nearby white areas for similar houses. Counterintuitive, because African Americans generally can afford less than white buyers. But economic forces, the decisions of lenders, meant that black buyers paid higher interest rates. Few lenders would give affordable, and furthermore, few lenders would give affordable home improvement loans in black neighborhoods, with the result that owners had to defer maintenance, take in boarders, or divide their homes into multifamily houses. Rent-to-own schemes sometimes cheated black home buyers out of their investments. You miss a payment, bam, you're out. Or your payment's late, bam, you're out, and we resell it to someone else who will screw just the way you got screwed. At the same time, black renters faced the problem that landlords knew that black tenants had few choices and could be charged high rents. And landlords could also poorly maintain their properties and still fill them with tenants. Because Avondale was already in transition from white to black by the 1950s, and because city planners hoped to provide good quality housing for blacks displaced from West End slum clearance and highway construction, they began in 1956 to develop the Avondale-Coreyville General Neighborhood Renewal Plan. The planners explicitly intended Coreyville to stay white, largely white, and Avondale to become mostly black. Much of the housing quality in Avondale in the 1950s was nice. There were wide tree-lined streets. It was very attractive, especially to middle-class African Americans who were leaving the West End, which was much more crowded. So Avondale was a desirable place to move, but at a price. The plan to preserve good housing, the city's plan to preserve good housing ultimately failed in Avondale, in large part because it provided no funding to assist struggling homeowners. They built parks, they widened roads, they put in street lights, but they failed to realize that homeowners needed help. The city also failed to enforce housing standards amid high demand, and that meant that landlords had little incentive to care for their rental properties. Planners also hoped to destroy the West End slums and move the planners who hoped to destroy the West End slums and move its residents to new neighborhoods now watched as the housing stock in Avondale and elsewhere began to decay. And much to the anger and upset of many of the new middle-class black residents who had moved to Avondale to escape overcrowding and decay in their old homes. Turnover was sometimes aided by unethical real estate agents of both races, commonly known as blockbusters. They resorted to a variety of fear tactics to encourage whites to sell at low prices to agents who then sold or rented the property at inflated prices to blacks. The presence of black neighbors was often enough to scare whites into selling at panicked prices to investors. In some cases, panic selling by whites might start when a white owner needed to sell quickly, and the quickest available buyer was black. Real estate agents then might take advantage of that situation to frighten other whites into selling. They would bombard white homeowners with phone call after phone call. They might move a black family into the neighborhood and then pay them to stroll around the neighborhood because the presence of a black family in a white neighborhood was enough for most whites to decide to leave. Some streets, some blocks literally flipped from white to black in 6 months to a year. Still have a remnant of my bronchitis. No, I'm fine, thanks. I've got sweetened tea. That's doing the job. Thanks. This scenario occurred in 1953 and 1954 in Avondale, north of the zoo, close to a black enclave that had existed since at least the 1920s. Soon real estate agents flooded the area, encouraging whites to sell and blacks to buy. But opposition to racial housing discrimination began to develop amongst some progressive whites during the 1950s, as that Avondale flipped from white to black. Two neighborhood councils, integrated neighborhood councils, including one in the area north of the zoo, were established to help create stable integrated neighborhoods. But these failed because too many whites held on to their racist fears, too many blacks desperately needed housing, and too many real estate agents were willing to encourage rapid turnover. Next slide. Black activists, of course, had long opposed racial discrimination in housing, but during the 1950s it became clear to some white leaders, including ones who had previously supported racial discrimination, racial segregation, that the destruction of the West End combined with a very restricted housing market for blacks was leading to the development of new slum conditions in Avondale and other racially changing neighborhoods. This combined with a growing belief among some white Americans that racial discrimination in all its forms interfered with the basic rights of black Americans. Remember, this is the period of the Montgomery bus boycott and the rise of the modern black civil rights movement. As a result of this changing thinking, a racially mixed group of housing reformers and civil rights organizations began to work to persuade whites to accept black neighbors and to bar racial housing discrimination by law. This is a picture from an Urban League pamphlet. I'm sure you cannot read the text, but you see what this drawing is intended to convey. Two women, presumably housewives, leaning over the fence, chatting. That white people and black people could live together normally and cordially. The attempt to persuade whites to accept black neighbors made little headway through the end of the 1950s. This pattern of failure, however, was broken after 1960 when an interracial group formed the North Avondale Neighborhood Association, or NANA. North Avondale included some of the most expensive homes in Avondale and some of its wealthiest residents. Though it had a relatively small black population at that time, the neighborhood had begun to attract African American professionals who could afford high quality housing, and also began to attract African American who could afford high quality housing, and who, along with their white neighbors, were determined to protect their property and neighborhood from blockbusters and slumlords. This was the point at the point when Theodore Berry, who later became Cincinnati's first black mayor, who was a prominent African-American attorney, head of the NAACP, city council member, Berry's family purchased a house in North Avondale or kind of on the border between North Avondale and Avondale on North Crescent Avenue. NANA focused its efforts on resisting the conversion of single-family homes to multifamily ones, keeping nuisances like bars and other alcohol-related businesses out of the business district, fighting along other housing reform organizations for legislation to bar racially discriminatory real estate practices, and the constant monitoring of housing quality. NANA's efforts proved successful in protecting its high-quality housing and establishing stable racial integration, which exists to this day. In addition, in the 1960s, NANA joined with several other groups, including Housing Opportunities Made Equal, which was dedicated to what they called fair housing. First Church and Home go together a long way back. One of the earliest executive directors of Home was a woman named Marjorie Jordan, who with her husband were important leaders, black leaders within First Church. And there were other First Church members who were involved in Home. In 1965, the coalition finally persuaded the Ohio General Assembly and Republican Governor James Rhodes to pass a fair housing bill. But that quickly proved weak and unenforceable. Clearly, Rhodes and the Republicans wanted to be able to say, hey, look, we're for civil rights, without actually doing anything about it. In 1968, Congress passed a Federal Fair Housing Act that, while also weak in some areas, provided the foundation for later strengthening amendments. Federal law on watchdog groups like Home eventually pushed most racial housing discrimination underground. Didn't stop it, but it pushed it, got rid of these the ads that I was showing you before, made it illegal for real estate professionals to offer houses in white areas to whites and black areas to blacks, to do racially explicit real estate sales. But it's taken Home and other watchdog groups continually monitor the real estate market to this day to make sure these kinds of practices are stopped whenever possible. In any case, such laws by the mid-1960s, mid to late 1960s, were too late to help Avondale residents obtain adequate housing choices. Avondale, south of the Mitchell-Dana corridor, grew increasingly crowded and decayed for all the reasons we've talked about. Black families who wanted to move to other neighborhoods faced a wall of racial discrimination. Landlords continued to subdivide single-family homes into multifamily, often illegally, while failing to maintain them. Some struggling homeowners found it difficult to maintain their properties. Recreational facilities for young residents were limited, and unemployment rates were growing, especially for young men. Most of the businesses in Avondale were owned by whites who lived elsewhere and mostly hired white employees. City housing inspectors failed to adequately enforce housing regulations intended to protect housing quality, and aid to struggling homeowners remained scarce. At the same time, I-71 was scheduled to displace black families from the eastern edge of the neighborhood, going right through the old black settlement that went from Reading and Martin Luther King over to the vicinity of the Harriet Beecher Stowe House in Walnut Hills. Some of the people who were going to be displaced by I-71 had already been displaced by urban renewal and the construction of I-75 through the West End. So two sets of forced displacement. Moreover, a mostly white Cincinnati Police Department patrolled the streets, often without adequate respect for the rights of black residents. These conditions combined in June 1967 with a series of confrontations between police and a group protesting the arrest for murder of a black suspect to cause an explosion of violence in Avondale and other Cincinnati black neighborhoods. This is a picture from 1967, probably on Reading Road in the vicinity of Avondale Town Center. When I first moved here, that in the mid-70s, that stretch of Reading Road was still vacant and trashed. The first black executive, the executive director of the Cincinnati Human Relations Commission, a man named David Feeders, who was its first black executive director, attributed the 1967 civil disturbance in part to frustration in African American communities over, quote, continuous uprooting by urban renewal programs of people during the past few years and dumping them without regard to their welfare or conditions of the areas where they've been dumped. McFeeters blamed the city administration and real estate interests for these conditions and asserted that city leaders had failed to understand that people could not be, quote, penned up like cattle in a stockyard and be expected to behave like civic-minded citizens. The commission fired McFeeters soon after he issued that report. Additional rioting occurred in April 1968 in the wake of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So next slide. So we're jumping ahead to the present. Avondale remains a largely African American community with a population its black population is 81% of the total. This is down about 9% from 2010, when it was, and it had been hovering around 90% for decades. Moreover, Avondale has remained a largely low-income community with 33% of its families at or below the federal poverty line. This was also down slightly from 36% in 2010. Decaying housing remains interspersed with well-tended houses. I urge you, at the very least, get in your cars and drive around Avondale's back streets. Lovely homes, well taken care of, sitting next to houses that are abandoned or neglected. Lots of Avondale's residents love their community, love their homes, take care of them, and lots of landlords, quite frankly, are only interested in extracting as much rent as they can, as much profit as they can. This failure to ensure that everybody in Avondale has decent housing has occurred despite the care of residents for their community and the heroic longtime efforts of Avondale housing activists and their allies. Recent development plans have provided new housing and have redeveloped the Avondale Town Center. It remains to be seen whether these efforts will help revitalize the community. Be that as it may, throughout Cincinnati and Hamilton County, we have largely failed to solve the problem of providing quality housing for Cincinnatians with low and moderate incomes. The county is tens of thousands of units short of housing affordable to low-income families. And most of this affordable housing shortfall is in African American areas. Moreover, census data shows that racial segregation remains high, though there are some bright spots. North Avondale, Kennedy Heights, and a number of other communities, some of them out in suburban Hamilton County. Meanwhile, developers build expensive housing in places like Hyde Park and Madisonville and Oakley and Evanston, subsidized by generous real estate tax breaks from the city. You know, those real estate taxes that just went up and you went, ah, when you read what your bill was. Well, part of what's going on is that these developers build or renovate houses in targeted areas and get, in some cases, massive breaks on their real estate taxes for 5, 10, or 15 years. Yet similar tax breaks rarely reach homeowners in Avondale and other black neighborhoods. Recently, I went through the city's database of these real estate tax breaks and mapped out where they were. Avondale, I think there were 2 or 3 in Avondale that went to apparently fairly wealthy families. I think mostly black families, and a handful that went to helping to build a couple of apartment complexes. But the dollar value of those was tiny compared to the dollar value of tax breaks in Hyde Park, Oakley, Madisonville, and some of the other upscale neighborhoods. So, if you don't live in one of those houses, your real estate taxes are helping to subsidize those tax breaks. Remember that. Oh, we've got a city council election coming up shortly, don't we? I'm not allowed to speak partisan politics from the pulpit, so I won't, but keep that in mind. At the same time, you see Children's Hospital and other institutions are rapidly expanding in the neighborhood. Avondale's population has decreased substantially in the last 50 years. By 2020, Avondale's total population had dropped by half, from 22,699 in 1970 to 11,345, likely driven in part by disinvestment and displacement. The long-term effects of all this remain to be seen, and here's where I put in a plug for a couple of things. If you haven't had a chance, Anne, have you taken down the posters yet?
No.
Okay.
I have to be out of here by 1:10, so it'll be done by then.
Okay, so after we get out of here, you have 25 minutes to go look at those posters. And if you're smart, you'll take pictures of them with your phones, and then you can go home and read them at your leisure. And maybe we can persuade Anne to turn them into a PDF booklet that will be available. Eventually, they will be a museum quality exhibit that will be available.
Yet to be determined. Originally, they were slated for the Avondale Business Center, but it turns out that public access is pretty limited there, so we're looking for another more widely accessible venue, like perhaps the lobby of the Ambrose Clement Health Center or the First Track.
Okay, good. Anyway, those will be available as a museum quality exhibit. The other plug I will make, two, the instructions for doing the Avondale Digital History Walking Tour are on our church website in the members only drive. I've sent out an email a couple of days ago with the URL, so you could go straight to that. And so you could, as a couple of people have done that, those tours from the comfort of their own homes, learning, yeah, and?
Just to make a comment, so that most of those tour stops are student work, and we would love your feedback. So if you notice something that's incorrect, undergraduate students aren't always the best fact checkers. I think we've done a good job of vetting them, but Fritz found an error, so I'm
Yeah, it's really important. It would be really helpful if, as you do these tours, either from the comfort of your own homes or your cars or on foot, Anne's going on foot.
Go on foot, go on foot, yeah.
Yes, Sally?
Yeah. How long is it on foot? I mean, how many miles?
It depends.
Well, it's 70 stops, so you don't want to do it all at once. Right. And for the day that you guys were going to do like our little beta testing for us, we broke it up into 8 different little clusters, where I gave you like go park your car at this place and do this little cluster. And I think that none of those clusters would be more than 40 minutes, and they're all relatively close together. If you were to try to do all of them together, it's really like walking from the zoo to the doctor.
Could you use this microphone?
Sure, Tim.
Let me turn it up then.
Okay. Should I need that? Should I use it? Well, 5 miles, 6 miles? Let's wait till Tim gets the mic. Okay, so the question was okay, cut to it. How many miles if we did the whole thing at once? So I honestly can't tell you for sure. I can tell you that during COVID, my kid and I walked, I live in Avondale on Mitchell, from Mitchell to the ballpark, and that was 7 miles, right? And took us 5 hours, but he was 10. So I think that's probably, if you zigged and zagged to get all these stops, that's probably about comparable. So yeah, maybe 5 or 6 miles. So it's not killer. It's like if you're an active, a hiker person, it would be doable. But we do also have them broken down into these little more manageable chunks.
If they didn't do it, it would be nice to know.
Sure, well, it would be great, actually, if you do it, and you do the whole thing at once. Will you tell me how many miles it is, and we'll put that information? That's great, thank you.
All right, the other plug I will make is that all of what I've said today is encompassed in some readings that I posted to the members only drive. Probably more understandable, certainly much more than I've been able to say today. The two, if you're only going to read a couple of them, read Going Home, which is a history done by a bunch of my students. I don't know, I've forgotten how long ago that was. That lays out the story of the struggle over housing discrimination in Cincinnati. And I did it as a project for Housing Opportunities Made Equal. There's an article by myself that's called Making the Second Ghetto in Avondale, from which a lot of this is drawn. And there are a number of other very useful articles and book chapters in there. And there's a bibliography that lists all of those articles and chapters. So, walking tour, bibliography. Question over here.
I had a question. So I know I did one walking tour,
Yeah.
just section 1. So anybody who does it again, you might just test to see if an iPad or would work better. I have trouble navigating on the phone. And then the other thing, I had a question in regards to the Jewish communities. You know, I wasn't sure if you had more to share about how they supported the African Americans coming into this area.
I have not done that research, so I can't really speak to that in any detail. But one of the articles on the members' drive is by a historian named Carla Goldman, who has studied the transition of. Her article is at least in part about the transition from Jewish religious institutions to black religious institutions. It's been several years since I've read it, but as I remember, it's a fascinating read.
I was just curious, just because it was hard to get, neighborhoods to begin to accept blacks, and the fact that Avondale did. I think that was
Well,
impressive.
I don't know if it's fair to say that Avondale did accept blacks.
Okay.
I think that there was some positive interaction between African Americans and some Jewish families. But you remember from the statistics I've quoted that whites, including Jews, moved out of Avondale in large numbers in the 1950s. So, this.
I could add one more thing to that.
So I think that the Jewish community was definitely interested in sort of moving out of Avondale, but leaving it in a way that it was a respectable, wonderful place to live. So they had this sense of like, this community had been our home for 50 years, and it's a beautiful, wonderful place to live, and we want to keep it that way and pass it down to our African American friends, but we're going to leave, but we want to help to also maintain this as this magical place that it was for us for 50 years. And so, there were things like Jewish real estate agents really going the extra mile to help black families find good homes. Now, of course, it lined their pockets as well, and it also meant that the Jewish family moving out used them when they moved to Bond Hill or wherever else. So it was good for those agents. I'm not saying they did it totally altruistically, but and things like Rockdale Temple gave the former temple at the corner of Rockdale and Burnett, I guess, right? As an African American community center for several years. They kept up paying the heating and the bills, and they paid the maintenance so that this would become an African American community space. And that worked out for a while. Unfortunately, in the rising tensions of the late 60s, I think those relationships soured in a number of ways, and ultimately Rockdale Temple was demolished. But I think that the initial intention was to sort of pass off this neighborhood as a wonderful place. And I think just the sort of, many factors led to that not really working out the way that the Jewish community had hoped, but I think that was their goal originally.
Just and a counterpoint, though, is in some of my research, I found Jewish real estate entrepreneurs who screwed over black buyers. So it's a complicated story. It's not as that there were a bunch of bad people and a bunch of good people. There was a full range of behavior, as you would expect in any human enterprise.
Thank you so much for all your work. It's so nice to hear the truth for a change.
Well, a version of the truth.
Wow, compared to what the other we get. Two things. It seems like we're pushing all the poor people up into Price Hill now. Is that what you have observed?
Well, yeah, there has been a significant amount of movement of low-income families over the Rhine and other low-income areas to places like Price Hill. I think also maybe driving around Coleraine Township, there are areas that look to me like, without having crunched the numbers, look to me like they're low-income families from elsewhere in the county have moved there. So there was one other point I wanted to push. On November 21st, we will have a panel of Avondale leaders who will talk about the present, about redevelopment efforts, and probably some people on the panel will not agree with other people on the panel about these redevelopment efforts. So it should be an interesting an interesting panel discussion.
I'm so discouraged about the lack of affordable housing. You know, a lot of the people I voted for city council, I thought they would do it. What do you think is stopping that? It's so sad that we have war veterans, mentally ill, living in the woods, and now we want to push them out of the woods. I don't know where the hell they're going to go, but we need affordable housing, and I'm wondering if you have any hope that that'll get
No hope. Sorry. So what I've found from my reading and my own research is that for the last 120, 125 years, the city of Cincinnati has said, we want to make good housing available to low-income people, and they botched it repeatedly. They've done it within a profit-oriented real estate market. You cannot build quality low-income housing. You cannot build quality housing for low-income people in a profit-motivated market. You cannot do that. And it's extremely difficult to do it even when you have some government subsidies, because the people who don't need the help I'll be damned if we'll let these poor people have our hard-earned tax dollars. So every attempt to solve the low-income housing crisis in Cincinnati for at least 125 years has failed. So, sorry to be a downer
Once
on
again,
that.
thanks for the truth.
So, any other questions before we go?
I just wanted to add, when I was a teenager, I found out my parents had signed a document that said, no blacks allowed in the neighborhood, and I was just appalled. Because when I was 14, they adopted 5 kids, 2 of whom were black.
Huh.
And they said, well, that's not, they said the document was no longer enforced, it wasn't legal. But we're talking 1964.
Okay, and when did they sign the document, do you know?
1952.
Okay, so those...
Minnesota.
What neighborhood?
Minnesota.
Oh, in Minnesota.
In St. Paul, all-white neighborhood, all-white high school. My
Yeah.
poor brother and sister had to grow up there.
So up through 1947, these deed restrictions that I showed were legal. They were legally enforceable by the courts and the police. Supreme Court, in a landmark case called Shelley versus Kramer, said that they could no longer be enforced by the courts and the police. So a lot of people have talked about de facto segregation, you know, implying that segregation was just, you know, just happened and it was people's choices. That's so much crap. Racial segregation in the North was legally enforced by federal, state, and local public policy from at least the beginning of the 20th century until the late 1960s, when it became largely illegal to discriminate on the basis of race, but when much of that discrimination went underground. And still, we still can see the impact of both the earlier above-ground racial discrimination and the on the underground racial discrimination. So, anything else? Thank you all for coming.